We heard Casey Rodemore in Consensus say last week that the creator of Ordinals and Runes, he said that 99.99% of projects at this conference today are scams.
Everyone getting involved in the space should do their own research. They should understand the risk they are taking. And, if you want to play the game, that's fine. At least you know what you are playing with. And I don't think there is any good or bad. I mean, it's good to have people that are here to make money, like it's good to have here people that want to invest.
They still think that Bitcoin is exactly the same as every other crypto project. And quite frankly, it's not, as I'm sure we'll get into in this conversation today.
Crypto needs more women. Let's face it, the space is still dominated by crypto bros. But not for much longer. The Bitcoin foxes are coming out to play. If you are a female founder, leader, or an inspiring one, join our mission as we drive change as only women can. What are you waiting for? Go and mint your Bitcoin fox.
Education is so important when it comes to Bitcoin adoption. And there are some people doing amazing work, traveling around the world, documenting how Bitcoin has changed people's lives, but also observing how Bitcoin has been slowly integrated into different societies and economies. Today on the show, I have the pleasure to have Joe Nakamoto, professional video journalist and Bitcoin educator. What we are going to be talking about? Well, obviously how we can better educate about Bitcoin, but also hear some amazing story of how Bitcoin is used around the world, and also reflecting a bit on what the future of Bitcoin can be. Now, before we get into the show, I'm going to ask you a favor. I know that many of you are watching our interviews, but they are not yet part of the community. So please go to YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and also follow us on social media to stay up to date with our news and interviews. Your support is so important for us to carry on doing an amazing work and bringing great guests on the show. And please, if you have got any comment or any feedback, please reach out to me. Send me a DM at Stefixi on Twitter or an email at steffi@financialfox.news. And remember, we don't give any financial advice on this channel, and you should never act at the back of any opinion that I share or my guests share on the show. You need to do your own research and you need to get educated and be 100% confident when you are making any investment decision. Remember that investing is risky, and when it comes down to crypto, is even more risky. So be careful and make sure that you are fully informed. There is plenty of material out there, and it's super important that you do that.
FinancialFox is proud to partner with HIVE Digital Technology, a public listed company focusing on building the green energy infrastructure for the AI revolution. HIVE was the first crypto miner to go public in Canada in 2017. They are also listed on Nasdaq and the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. They hodl, and they are a leader in efficient Bitcoin mining with the best hash rate realization in the industry. They are operational, powered by green energy, hydropower in Sweden and Canada, and geothermal in Ireland. HIVE was also the first crypto miner to buy GPUs, chips, and have an AI strategy. And that's very exciting considering the AI data center are such a high profitable business. Finally, and most importantly, HIVE care about shareholders. That's why their strategy is low dilution, low G&A, and focus on cash flow. If you don't know HIVE, check them out at hivedigitaltechnology.com and follow them on social media. Remember, AI is the future and Bitcoin is rising as a new asset class. Some analysts have a target price above $100,000 for 2024, but let's see. For now, we hodl, and don't forget to check out HIVE. More information in the description.
How did you learn about Bitcoin?
First time was on the Silk Road in 2011, 2012, when I was a student. Friends of mine were using that website. Obviously, it wasn't me, in case the FBI is listening. And, they are listening. So yes, it wasn't me, FBI agents listening. And, but I completely ignored it. And I thought it was rubbish, slow, redundant technology that doesn't really make sense. Which is what a lot of the crypto people believe right now, funnily enough. They still say it's slow and doesn't work and doesn't scale. And it took me a long, long time and several more touch points until I realized that this Bitcoin thing might be as consequential as the invention of the printing press or electricity or one of these other things that when it's first invented, people dismiss it and say this can't be possible. And slowly but surely, this tiny intransigent minority spreads throughout the rest of humanity, and people realize, this Bitcoin thing might actually be not just incredibly useful, but very, very transformative. And for me, those touch points were, there was a very rich surfer that I met in Lisbon in 2017, the first time I moved here. And he had this like really thick, really nice Patagonia wetsuit. And I was like, how on earth did you get this? And he was like, oh, Bitcoin, dude, you should look at it. And I was like, nah, man, I don't trust this guy. He's a scammer. And then in 2019, my driver in Abidjan, the capital of the Ivory Coast, it's actually the business capital. The real capital is Yamoussoukro, but where everything goes on is Abidjan. And this man was using Bitcoin as a remittance tool from his son who lived in Paris. And I, of course, stopped him and said, Guillaume, this is a scam. What are you doing? Do not use Bitcoin. Use a currency remittance service like TransferWise or MoneyGram or one of these other wonderful remittance services which charge you at least 20% for the pleasure of sending money all around the world. So yeah, it took me a long time and perhaps too much time to come around to Bitcoin, but I eventually realized that I needed to dedicate my own time, whether it's my own skills or my whatever I can bring to the table, to helping people learn about Bitcoin and trying to make Bitcoin education and Bitcoin content more approachable, a little bit more mainstream, maybe a bit more basic, you could make the argument as well.
Yeah.
In the hope that it would reach out to those people who still think that Bitcoin is evil. They still think that Bitcoin is bad for the planet. Or, this is perhaps the worst one, they still think that Bitcoin is exactly the same as every other crypto project. And quite frankly, it's not, as I'm sure we'll get into in this conversation today.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, if I think about my family, I'm from Italy, and the first time I talked to my dad about Bitcoin, it probably was 2018, and he was saying, "Oh no, stay away! How can you get into that kind of like scam?" And he was right, really, really negative. And I think that especially when you go to some rural places, they still very suspicious about Bitcoin, and then if we count, like we said, the overall crypto space, I think that's even worse because there are so much scams and so much like rug pulls, like we were discussing before. So people are always kind of like be very careful. And but yes, I think for me it was like 2017. I read the white paper and I said, right, something here is new, is different. I want to be part of it. And that was kind of like my take, where I see that I know that you come from like a journalistic background. I was a journalist in a previous life, and we have got that kind of inquisitive and curiosity where we want to actually understand it before we kind of like do anything with it. So does it happen with you as well, the way you read the white paper and you said, wow, this is like a game changing, or how that click happened in your experience?
I wish there was a wow, I understood that moment, but I think like most people, you get to page 5 of the white paper and it starts to appear like Greek or Chinese to me.
Yeah.
It was particularly when the longer form equations come in. I don't come from a very mathsy background. Like I studied economics at university and languages, but that is actually a hindrance, not a help when it comes to understanding Bitcoin. So yeah, there wasn't necessarily a wow moment for me. Like I guess the epiphanies and those real light bulb experiences when the Lightning Network started to really pick up steam. Like now I realize that I can send money around the world like for fractions of a penny or a couple of sats, and you can do all sorts of crazy experimental stuff. Like I can be on a FaceTime call and someone can pay for my drink as long as I'm showing that QR code on the screen, or I can welcome someone to Bitcoin and hundreds or perhaps thousands of Bitcoin believers all around the world are able to then also send that person money with no friction, no barrier to or a very, very low barrier to entry, or tweeted out QR codes and people have paid for my beer when I've been in London and they've been in Miami or whatever. Like these kind of things and the repercussions, the consequences of that are the things that get my brain sort of whirring. I know that Bitcoin doesn't need to be money as a means of exchange right now, but it's one of the parts of the space that I get quite excited about. Like the HODL narrative and the store of value, Bitcoin as a store of value. In my opinion, it's it's got credence. Enough people buy into it, enough institutions, enough ETFs, blah, 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 have believed that Bitcoin is a store of value. It is, gold 2.0, it's digital gold, whatever you want to call it. It's a great place to save money. The next sort of rungs on this ladder of adoption include the medium of exchange and include the Bitcoin as a remittance tool. And so that's where I was like, you can actually use it instantaneously and for very cheap costs to send money around the world. So perhaps there wasn't a dramatic epiphany, aha moment. I wasn't in the bath shouting eureka, but I was. There was a series of instances and realizations of the tech that I was like, this is so cool, and we're just scratching the surface of where Bitcoin as a payments and store of value technology will take us in the future. So yeah, that's also what gets me really excited about it. And with my own professional and personal experiences, traveling around the world and seeing Bitcoin used as money in places that would really surprise you, whether it's the mountains of Machu Picchu in Peru, or it's on the streets of Cuba, or it's in, an African township or slum in South Africa, or even, a tiny remote rural village in Eastern Ghana. These are all places that I've documented, I've videoed, and I've been to demonstrate that people are using Bitcoin in very creative and ways that perhaps might surprise us in the West. That's what gets me excited, and that's what I want to continue sort of making content and showing people about.
Do you want to share maybe one of the places that you have been, and maybe one of the craziest things or the most interesting things that you have heard about how Bitcoin has been integrated into a community or into the local economy?
Maybe let's go for Cuba, because I think we can all agree, and I think all your listeners will agree as well, that communism is not a very good idea, when it comes to the state controlling every means of production, when it means the state is controlling the media, meaning that there is only one party information and there is one newspaper that you read every day, and there is only, a very controlled, firewalled way of getting online. I think we can all agree that communism in 2024 is crap, and we should do all we can to undermine and defeat it. But yet there are still very communistic countries around the world. One of the last bastions of communism is, of course, Cuba. Now, I went to Cuba because I read Alex Gladstein's book called Check Your Financial Privilege. And this book is a series of chapters about people using Bitcoin in interesting ways all around the world, from Nigeria to Southeast Asia to Cuba. And so I went to Cuba with a few of these names in my head to meet up with them and to interview them. But of course, it's illegal to do journalism in Cuba without getting the government's, go ahead. So I arrived in Cuba as a tourist, and I bounced around the Bitcoin community and went all over Havana, which is the capital city of Cuba and the biggest city. And we effectively documented how Cubans are using Bitcoin, how they're able to use Bitcoin when the internet is incredibly surveilled and firewalled there, and whether or not they're able to afford to use Bitcoin, given that the layer one transaction fees of Bitcoin can sometimes spike to upwards of $20. So, if you're on $2 a day, which is what a lot of Cubans earn, because of course the state also manages money supply and the salaries of literally almost everyone in the economy. How do you use this tool, which is, as the crypto media would say, slow, expensive, too hard to use? And so then we realized that, they're all Lightning native. Most, if not all, Cubans are stacking on the Lightning network. And when they have a big enough UTXO, they might then move to Bitcoin layer one or on-chain Bitcoin for long-term, lifelong savings, for example. So that was like one of the really interesting things we learned. Another thing is that, of course, raising funds in Cuba is very hard because of the embargo that the US and other countries impose on Cuba. So they can't get in the things that we all take for granted. I would not be able to have these headphones, this microphone. Even running a node is very tricky in Cuba. And yet they still manage to cobble together enough sort of tools and electronic devices to be able to run their own rudimentary nodes across Cuba. So I visited in May of last year. I released a documentary in August, and it's 40 minutes long. If you just type in Cuba Bitcoin into YouTube or your video engine of choice, you should see my face, and I do encourage you to click on it. It's not the content that I make anymore, because this content I made with Cointelegraph, but I just think that it's very meaningful content because we are slowly seeing the seeds of Bitcoin spreading across Cuba. And through that, you're seeing the seeds of freedom spread across Cuba. Because, of course, Bitcoin is freedom technology in that no one can stop you from transacting. Whereas with the Cuban peso, the government can easily stop you from transacting, whilst the peso is also being completely, it's basically at the levels of hyperinflation now. While I was there, the Cuban peso lost, I think it was $10 of value just in the 10 days that we were there.
Wow.
But it was getting worse and worse and worse. And since I went to Cuba and we hosted the first ever Bitcoin meetup on the island, the Cuban Bitcoin community has done even more incredible work, and they are now teaching the My First Bitcoin program at 3 locations in the country, and they're continuing to spread this message of, Bitcoin is a freedom tool, Bitcoin is money that cannot be seized, and ultimately the world is trending towards Bitcoin, even in places that would surprise you, such as, of course, a very communist playground, such as Cuba. So that would be probably my first one.
Can you give me one example in Europe?
Sure. One story which I love, which is a farmer in Northern Ireland who was struggling to make money. And this has become quite a popular theme in the United Kingdom at the moment. So basically, this man called Jeremy Clarkson is a very famous television presenter in the UK. He was then hired by Amazon maybe 5 years ago after being on the BBC for maybe 20 years doing this program called Top Gear. Anyway, he then bought a farm, and in 2019, 2020, he started to actually run the farm. And Amazon Prime then filmed him doing all the work on the farm, and it became a real pandemic box set that everyone ended up watching. But the first year that he managed the farm, he made a profit of £14, around about that amount. So he made basically nothing. But everyone in the nation was watching this, and everyone was alerted to the fact that farmers in the UK are really struggling to make money. And farming as a profession is not the sort of one you go into unless you have a real love for the land. So this is the context of farming in the UK. Separately, I went to Northern Ireland to meet a farmer there who sells animal feed to other farms. So like the stuff that the chickens eat, the cows eat, that kind of thing. And he also he had sheep on the land as well. So of course he was selling the wool. And he also had long grass that he would sell for, I think it was like manure. He had lots of different things going on, and that's what lots of farms do. And to generate the electricity to manage all this, and for the grass, he would put it in this thing called an anaerobic digester. An anaerobic digester is a great big bathtub in which you put all this animal waste, and then methane gas is emitted. This methane gas is then captured and then turned into electricity. You know where this is going now, Steffi. So with this electricity, he was selling some to the grid sometimes it was a premium. Say at 5 o'clock in the evening, he could sell that electricity to the grid and he'd get a good amount for it. But at midnight, at 1 a.m., at 3 a.m., at 5 a.m., no one was consuming this electricity. And yet the bathtub of this anaerobic digester was still churning, and he still had to put grass into it and animal waste and all that sort of stuff to make the electricity. So he's like, what can I do with this electricity? So he looked up solar panels, he looked at wind farms, he looked at battery storage, he looked at all sorts of ways of capitalizing on this wasted or stranded energy. And eventually he spoke to this Irish startup called Skilling Digital Mining, and they said, listen, Farmer Tom, have you heard of Bitcoin mining? And he was like, no, but why don't we give it a go? And so I went there 2 years ago or a year ago maybe, and I documented how he's converted his farm from an agricultural outlet to a electrical sort of Bitcoin mining outlet. And since then, he's also mined a few Bitcoin, and he's managed to make his farm a lot more profitable and, of course, a lot more sustainable for the future. And just in case any of your listeners are like avid anti-Bitcoin mining, anti-energy consumption critics, this energy was wasted, okay? There is nowhere it could go but either into a battery or into he could have invited 100 Teslas in his village to come to his farm at 1 a.m. in the morning and charge up the Teslas. And that could have also been a use for the energy. But instead, he's put it into securing the soundest money known to mankind because it was the most effective and the most profitable way of doing so. So he's now able to farm for a long period of time whilst also mining some Bitcoin. I've got a similar story like this coming out next week about a guy in the United Kingdom who's gone completely off grid and no longer pays bills in the UK thanks to power from the sun.
Fantastic. Well, I completely agree with you on the energy point. I think there is so much misconception and, no proper education about what Bitcoin mining is actually bringing to the energy grid. And, if you actually look under the hood, you see the importance you see how the grid is so sensitive, and sometimes having something like Bitcoin mining that can tap in and rebalance the energy grid is quite interesting. And I think, that's all comes down to a lot of education that has to be done. And so on the education side, you are a video journalist, right? You've done a lot of work in the past, maybe not related to Bitcoin. So you kind of know the importance of education. And how are you approaching Bitcoin education? So what's your way to kind of tell people the Bitcoin story and onboard them to this new asset class?
Great question. There's no perfect way to answer this because for me, the answer is always changing. Like it's a work in progress thing. When I first joined the sort of the crypto space, because I worked as a journalist at Cointelegraph, a reporter there, I initially worked at DappRadar, but that place is like just effectively promoting scams. And I lost sleep over the amount of times that a project would rug pull or a crypto project would go to zero. And I was just like, I can't deal with this. At least with Cointelegraph, they gave me the freedom to focus on almost exclusively Bitcoin reporting. And I'm pretty sure we both agree that Bitcoin in 2024 isn't going to rug pull. Even if Satoshi comes back, it just means the price might crash, but that doesn't matter. The Bitcoin protocol still keeps ticking on. So yeah, Bitcoin education. I've tried lots of different avenues, and I think the one that I'm exploring right now, which is these sort of watchable, entertaining YouTube vlogumentary or mini documentaries of say 10 to 20 minutes long that explores somewhere interesting around the world using Bitcoin in a creative or curious way. I found that tends to resonate quite well with an audience. And I do lots of little pop-up text boxes on the screen to remind people of industry terms that sometimes we take for granted in the industry, but are perhaps misunderstood or not as common for the layperson, someone that's actually doing a normal job and just has a tangential interest in Bitcoin because say they put £20 into or €20 into Bitcoin every week. And it's just a saving. But they might be like, but what is this actually doing to the world? And like, how do I keep abreast of the latest stories in Bitcoin? And so that's where I hope my content comes in, and checking out a video that I publish every week about Bitcoin being used in a fun way helps people. In terms of like my personal actions with my friends now, I haven't given up, but I've definitely stopped trying as hard as I did 5 years ago, because at some point you just have to take a deep breath and say, listen, they're not ready, or they don't care, or they're not in a position to care, or that there's no incentive for them to care. Like for my friends that work in finance, they're fine. They work on six-figure salaries in London, and the fears that we have of inflation and of government insolvency and of the debt burden getting completely out of this world, they don't really care about it, and they're not thinking about it because they're getting, $8,000 into the bank account every month, and they're fine. So I think you've also got to be realistic with your educational desires and realize that you can certainly help some people approach Bitcoin a bit differently, but you're not going to help everyone. But that's just like a lesson in teaching generally, isn't it?
Yeah, no, 100%. But I think, even these people in finance, I think obviously with the Bitcoin spot ETFs and everything that is happening in the Bitcoin space, I think they have started to get notice, and they are actually realizing how Bitcoin has become, at least, like you said, a store of value. But there is much more happening, and that's something that I also want to, get your take on that. Everything happening more on the layer 2, DeFi, actually building on Bitcoin. And I know that you have dived deep into also the ordinal space. So tell me a little bit where we are, what's the future of Bitcoin is looking like, and in your opinion, and where we are going from here.
Cool. The L2 space. We heard Casey Rodemore in Consensus say last week that the creator of Ordinals and Runes, he said that 99.99% of projects at this conference today are scams. In the L2 space on Bitcoin, it's 99.9999999% of these projects are scams, rug pulls, or they're certainly a little bit fraudulent, let's say. They're going to promise wonderful things like we're going to bridge to Ethereum and to Solana, and it's going to allow you to get access to this liquidity pool and this token, this DeFi access and blah, blah, blah. But the reality is that there are some founders that know this cheat code of launching a token, getting VC buy-in, getting it listed on exchanges, and then dumping on retail. And it's a tale as old as crypto time itself, and yet it keeps happening. So to anyone listening, like when you hear Bitcoin L2, you should immediately think, how are they trying to take my money? Okay. Most Bitcoin L2s are inherently very dodgy, very scammy. There are some cool things being built around Bitcoin, not necessarily on Bitcoin, because that's another discussion in of itself. Like, what is an L2? What defines an L2? Currently, most people say that there are only really two Bitcoin L2s. It's Lightning and it's Omni, because they're the only L2s that actually can collapse onto Bitcoin on-chain without their need for a third-party intervention. So when you look at all these weird, wonderful, wacky other L2s, most of the time there is a custodian or a DEX or a third party that you must trust in order for you to get your funds back. The whole point of Bitcoin is to remove trust in a third party. It is, as the white paper says, a peer-to-peer cash system. There is no need for a middleman. It removes that third party out of it because, of course, Bitcoin was created in light of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So we have to be really, really worried and have this always front of mind when we're approaching all of these L2, so be it, projects in the Bitcoin space. There's nothing that I'm personally investing in or really, really excited about, although the conversations I have with my crypto friends, they're very excited about it. So what does that tell you? It tells you there's a lot of money to be made and that there's going to be a lot of retail getting burnt. And you just don't want to be on the wrong side of one of these projects or these trades. To give you an example of what I've done personally to investigate into this space, I went to the Bitcoin Hong Kong conference. It was called Bitcoin Asia, I think. And the last day was the Ordinals day. And I went around interviewing projects and just asking them to explain to me how the pre-mine worked. And all of them explained to me, play by play, how the pre-mine works. And as you know, like Ethereum, for example, had a 70% pre-mine, which means that Ethereum, Joe Lubin, Vitalik, and all their pals got early access to this token before anyone else could buy it. This is how stocks get listed. This is how companies are built. And yet these people call themselves cryptocurrencies. Like, how dare you? That is so scammy. It is not a cryptocurrency. It is a crypto company. And you're seeing this again and again with the Bitcoin L2 space. So to anyone thinking about it, do your research, by all means, understand how these tools are panning out, but realize that you're probably going to get dumped on. And it's going to be the exact same experience that we saw as DeFi summer or the NFT phase or the metaverse phase or the ICO phase. Like, must we continue these horrible cycles of scams? Okay, Bitcoin Maxi rant over. I'll let you digest that. Sorry.
No, I think, listen, is a good point, and everyone getting involved in the space should do their own research. They should understand the risk they are taking. And, if you want to play the game, that's fine. At least you know what you are playing with. And I don't think there is any good or bad. I mean, it's good to have people that are here to make money, like it's good to have here people that want to invest. So, but there is a lot of scams out there.
That's where I disagree. That's where I struggle. So when you walk into a casino, you are fully aware that it is a casino.
Yeah.
When you walk onto a crypto exchange or to a DEX, you don't know that it's a casino, but it is. And the house is pretty much always going to win. Yeah, there's always someone that's going to put 10K into your next meme coin and turn it into 100K or $1 million. But most people, and like we know this from conversations with our Uber drivers or our hairdressers or the people that we meet on the street that you mention, oh yeah, I'm interested in Bitcoin. They say, oh yeah, I've got this cool crypto project. I'm like, mate, you are in a casino. You just do not realize it. And so that's the bit that I really worry about. Like, yes, free will, libertarianism, the ability to choose what we want to do with our money. Sure, but within the guise of being informed that it is a casino that we're entering. And so I'm really sorry I had to jump in there, but I just have to say that.
No. It is super important to, all this disclaimer and upfront saying the risk that people take is always super important. That definitely goes without saying. So I see that you are a bit cautious about ordinals. And I believe you will be even more cautious about runes.
I mean, when we come to so we were talking about L2s before, and now then there's Ordinals and Runes, which is a different system. I wouldn't really call it L2, it's more like a numbering system. And, like I've interviewed Casey and done panels with him about this, and it's a space that if you want to believe in it, you can. But if you don't want to believe in it, you don't have to. Because there is no such thing as a rare sat. Some people believe there are rare sats, and therefore there is value to that, because as humans create belief around things, it creates value, because there is no such thing as intrinsic value. It's all about perceived value, which is another thing that in economics growing up, you are taught, and then you realize, oh crap, it's wrong. Like, how useful is a glass of water to a man who's drowning? Probably not very useful. And yet to me this morning, yeah, it's pretty useful. So I'll spend money on it, right? And this is the thing that I find very interesting. And you can definitely apply this to ordinals, right? If you want to believe that the numbering system for individual Satoshis in a block is what you believe, then great. Your ordinal will have value, and the thing you attach to it, whether it's a piece of work or a JPEG, whatever, that can have value too. For runes, I didn't look enough into it. It launched the day of the halvings. So I thought it would have a similar impact to what ordinals did to the mempool, in terms of miners would get really happy because they're getting a huge amount in transaction fees. But it seemed to be a flash in the pan, and within a couple of days, runes interest seemed to fall off a cliff. Whereas there are still people getting really excited about ordinals, but as I understand it, most projects are down 60 to 70%. So for me, it brings up memories of the NFT craze 2 or 3 years ago, 2021, 2022. So yeah, I'm not like that excited about it. I think the idea of keeping information on a permanent ledger, I find that idea interesting. I've never I felt compelled to do it myself, put my own birth certificate on the blockchain forever, because I just think there's other better ways of doing it. And I'm a bit purist when it comes to, I like Bitcoin to be money, and I think it's really cool as money, and I think it really works as money. And, having spent the past week at the Oslo Freedom Forum, where you're talking about how activists are using Bitcoin as money because it is the ultimate tool that helps you to usurp dictators and get money from crisis zones, then it's even harder to get supportive of people not using Bitcoin as money. You know what I mean? It's like just because you can use a hammer to dent a car, it doesn't mean that it's not less useful for building a house. But I'd rather people focus on using hammers for building houses as opposed to denting cars or harming people, whatever it may be. Again, I'm getting really maxi here, and I feel like I'm sort of doing a public service announcement. So I'm sorry about that, but I just it's Bitcoin is money,
It is interesting. You see, like with a very specific purpose, but at the same time, the overall economy and financial market are changing, and we need to have digital money. We need to have a new system to build this new finance, and that's perhaps where all this experimentation on Bitcoin can be useful as exactly as an experiment to see what works, what makes everything more efficient. And obviously, if you want to save, you're not going to save outside Bitcoin, right? Let's say it that way. And also, you make sure that you store your Bitcoin, because I think this is also another very important aspect, just tied in what you said about decentralized exchange. If you are buying Bitcoin and you keep it on Coinbase, then I don't think it's really useful, let's say, or it's not the best decision. Step forward, how do you make sure that you also educate about this extra bit? Because it's not just about getting people to understand, right? If you want to have your insurance against inflation, you look at Bitcoin and, you understand why you are getting there and how that can help you to be financially free. But at the same time, you need to have the tools to make sure that you really own Bitcoin. And that takes a little bit of extra work.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it's like learning to use money, regular fiat money. For most people, they're taught by their parents from a young age, and then they're slowly exposed to it over time. And I think with Bitcoin, it has to be relatively similar. We need to learn good practices. We need to learn good behaviors. And as with any other skill, whether it's driving a car or learning to tie our shoelaces, it's going to take some time, and there's going to be a few fuck ups along the way, let's say. So, yeah, I mean, in my content, I'm constantly preaching self-custody. I'm constantly preaching better UTXO consolidation and management. And I try to use examples from what I see around the world to make it easier for people in the West or wherever they're watching from to understand it too. So, for example, in Bitcoin Akazi, which is a township in South Africa, there are teenagers who are using hardware wallets. These are teenagers who haven't had the education that you or I have had. These are teenagers that have had a really crappy deck of cards dealt to them, which is their life, and they have to manage with that. And yet they are still able to use a hardware wallet. The one they use in Akazi is a Jade wallet, is the one that Blockstream make. And they are still able to save in Bitcoin, to consolidate the UTXOs properly, and to think about their future a little bit differently because of that. So if you're in the West and you've still got your money on a bloody Coinbase or something, then delete Coinbase, get a hardware wallet, and sort it out properly. Right? This Bitcoin thing is going to outlive us all. And if you're not taking it seriously now, then you're going to really hate yourself in 10 years' time or 5 years' time when you realize, oh no, I didn't actually own that Bitcoin that belonged on a Coinbase or a Kraken or any other exchange. So I think, people need to take it a bit more seriously. And there's been so many incidents where we've realized that, oh crap, I shouldn't trust a third-party custodian, whether it's an FTX or a Celsius
Blockify,
or a Luna or all of these crashes. They should make it abundantly clear to people that we need to take custody of our funds. And when you see the way the ETF is going, like the US is going to own so much Bitcoin soon. It doesn't actually necessarily mean anything because Bitcoin remains decentralized and secure. But if you're buying Bitcoin in the ETF, it's not really your Bitcoin, is it? It's like the Bitcoin you leave on Coinbase. It's not really your Bitcoin. You're not going to be able to buy a house with it, a car with it, buy a nice holiday with it, or even just buy a coffee with it because, it's custodied by someone else. I appreciate there are certain people that are never going to get self-custody. My mum, for example, love her to bits, but she hates what I do anyway, but like she's not going to come around to suddenly like, remembering 12 words or 24 words. Likewise, if you have a mental illness or you're in your 80s or 90s or you're, under the age of 15, say, or even the age of 20, I'd say it's going to be quite hard to self-custody correctly, and you might make some mistakes. So I'm not saying that self-custody is for absolutely bloody everyone, but that's why we have friends, family members, and younger people within our support networks who can help us out with these things. I just try to illustrate with my content that, hell yeah, like there are teenagers in South Africa that are doing this. So what is your excuse? Take custody of your Bitcoin today, please.
100%. So last question. If we look at the future, right, we see now Bitcoin, okay, store of value investment, and it's already kind of like a big movement, right? The government is getting in the middle, especially after, we see institutions got into the space in 2021. I don't want to say that we start to see potentially Bitcoin used as geopolitical power, but, it's probably going to happen. Because you're such a big picture guy and you kind of like get into this discussion about freedom and society, I just would like to see to understand, how do you see things, what role Bitcoin is going to play in the overall world system, and or what perhaps we should be wary or we should be careful of happening, if you don't have like a full, obviously we don't have a magical ball, but yeah.
Wow, that's a huge question. I mean, very succinctly, I don't know, and I shouldn't know either. But from what I've seen,
we shouldn't know. We shouldn't know.
Yeah, like if we could predict, wouldn't that be amazing? But also, we'd lose a bit of the surprise and the zest for life that we get from these unexpected situations. When I look at sort of Bitcoin being used around the world, it truly is for anyone. It's not necessarily for everyone, but it definitely is for anyone. And like in a couple of weeks, I'm going to Ukraine, right, to see how Ukrainians use Bitcoin at the start of the war. And you can make some really strong arguments for how Bitcoin is the most wonderful tool there, because we're able to get Bitcoin to a crisis zone, to a war zone incredibly quickly and distribute it amongst troops and helping people to support and, blah, blah, blah. Amazing stuff, right? But equally, Russia was probably using Bitcoin to circumvent sanctions. So, oh no, Bitcoin's the worst thing in the world. You can look at Bhutan, which is mining Bitcoin because it has abundant hydropower. But you can also look at Kazakhstan, which is mining Bitcoin with coal. So for every amazing thing that Bitcoin does, there is a counter argument that the mainstream media is going to focus on and hone in on to try and deliver this point that Bitcoin is horrific for humanity. So it's ultimately up to, this is why I love Bitcoin. It's ultimately up to people to choose how to use it in the way that they see fit. And there's going to be people hating on Bitcoin in 10 and 20 years and 30 years. But there's also going to be this growing minority, as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, this intransigent minority, which is slowly realizing that, holy crap, maybe money printing isn't the best way to solve all our problems. And maybe we shouldn't trust this sort of elite group of individuals to control our, the way in which we use money and whether or not I can spend my money, or, in China, whether or not my money should expire, or in Nigeria as well, the way in which they introduced their CBDC, they did it in a way that meant that if you didn't spend your money within 30 days, it would expire. So I think that people do want the choice to be able to use the tools most applicable for their lives. And Bitcoin, for me, is the best monetary tool known to mankind. So yeah, we're definitely going to see more and more trending towards Bitcoin. The way in which we get there, that's the big question. And it could get serious, it could get dirty. It's definitely going to be full of surprises. Like I had no idea that El Salvador would adopt Bitcoin as legal tender, for example. I didn't think the ETFs would be approved this year either.
Yeah.
And yet here we are, 3 years into El Salvador's Bitcoin adoption story, and the country is doing, well, human rights stuff aside, it's doing very, very well. Likewise with the US Bitcoin spot ETF. When the ETF was announced, Bitcoin was like 40K or something, and everyone sort of hated Bitcoin. Now it's in the 60s or 70s, and the tide of public opinion is slowly turning towards a more pro-Bitcoin world.
I'm excited to see Bitcoin moving its waves, but at the same time, I'm, if you think deeply of what could happen with all these big powers, then, it could get really dangerous. But, we will live and we will see. Joe, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Grazie mille, Steffi. Thank you very much to you, and thank you very much to your listeners to hanging out until the end. I really hope I've maybe brightened their day, and if not, just persuaded them to take Bitcoin a bit more seriously. This is part of the educational drive, doing this kind of thing.
Definitely. And I incentivize everybody to go and check out Joe's YouTube channel and really understand how Bitcoin has changed the lives of many people.
Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah, it's Joe Nakamoto. It should turn up wherever you type it in on YouTube and Twitter and X and Nostr and everything else.